A car so carefully hand-built that real human beings signed their names to it before it ever left the factory. Supervisors. Craftspeople. Their signatures in ink on paper, tucked inside a leather portfolio in the trunk of your brand new Buick. And it still couldn't find a single buyer who cared. This is the story of a dream that General Motors built with its own two hands and strangled with those same hands before it ever had a chance to breathe. Let's go back to 1981. Ronald Reagan is in the White House. MTV just launched. And somewhere inside the boardrooms of General Motors, a quiet panic is beginning to set in. Buick has a problem. Not a small problem. Not a tweak the marketing kind of problem. An existential problem. The kind that keeps executives awake at 3 in the morning, staring at sales charts that look like a ski slope headed straight downhill. The average Buick buyer is getting older. Every single year. And younger buyers? The upwardly mobile professionals, the college graduates buying their first real car, the men and women who wanted something that turned heads when they pulled up to a restaurant. They weren't walking into Buick dealerships anymore. They were walking into BMW dealerships. They were driving Autos. They were going German and not looking back. Buick had become your grandfather's car. Soft. Quiet. Forgettable. The automotive equivalent of comfortable slippers and an early dinner reservation. You didn't buy a Buick because it excited you. You bought a Buick because you had already given up on being excited. And that was the crisis. Because here's the thing about Buick that most people forget. This brand had real prestige. For decades, Buick sat just one step below Cadillac in the General Motors hierarchy. If you were a successful doctor, a factory manager who had worked his way up from nothing, a businessman in a mid-sized city who wanted people to know he had made something of himself without shouting about it, you bought a Buick. It was aspirational without being ostentatious, ambitious without being arrogant. But BMW had figured out something General Motors hadn't. They figured out that aspiration had changed. The new American dream wasn't quiet and comfortable anymore. It was sharp and sporty and European. And they were eating Buick's lunch, one sale at a time, one dealership at a time, one lost customer at a time. Enter Lloyd Roos. Roos became Buick's chief engineer in 1975, arriving during one of the worst sales years the division had seen in living memory. He was a mechanical engineer out of the University of Missouri, the son of a Chevrolet dealer from Belleville, Illinois. A genuine, dyed-in-the-wool car guy in an organization that was increasingly run by finance people and spreadsheet thinkers. And he looked at Buick's situation and made a decision that was either brilliantly bold or dangerously reckless, depending on which year you are standing in when you make that judgment. He decided to fight. He turbocharged the lineup. He pushed performance additions across nearly every model in the range. He championed a black, menacing, rear-wheel drive coupe called the Regal Grand National, a car so far removed from the Buick image of the time that journalists couldn't quite believe it wore that badge. The GNX variant, limited to just 547 cars in 1987, could sprint from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 4.7 seconds. From a Buick, powered by a 6-cylinder engine. Car and driver put it through the quarter mile in 13.5 seconds at 102 miles per hour. A Buick with a V6 was embarrassing Corvettes at the drag strip. That sentence would have been unthinkable 10 years earlier. By 1983, after Roos had been promoted to general manager, Buick hit an all-time sales record and climbed to number 3 in domestic sales for the first time since 1956. The transformation was working. Buick was no longer your grandfather's car. It was the car that beat your grandfather's Corvette at the traffic light. It was in that atmosphere of momentum and genuine confidence that a couple of Roos's brightest people came to him with an idea. Product planning chief Jay Qualman and strategic planning manager Lynn Salata laid it out simply. Buick needed a halo car. Not a sports car, exactly.
Something more sophisticated than that.
A 2-seat personal luxury coupe in the tradition of the great European Grand Tourers. The kind of car that would hang on bedroom walls as a poster. The kind of car that would make someone walk into a Buick dealership and say out loud with genuine surprise, "Okay, maybe this brand isn't what I thought it was." A statement. A declaration of intent. A car that said Buick was serious. They called it the Reatta. In August of 1981, General Motors' Product Policy Group granted concept approval. The plan was clean and it was sensible. They would base it on a shortened version of an existing GM platform already proven across several divisions. They would use established mechanical components to keep development costs manageable. And they would launch it as a 1984 model, just 3 years from approval to the showroom floor. It took 7 years. And the story of why it took 7 years is the story of everything that was wrong with General Motors in the 1980s. It is a masterclass in how a great American corporation, with brilliant people and resources that most automakers could only dream of, can take a genuinely good idea and slowly, methodically, almost accidentally destroy it. The first blow came from inside the house. In 1984, General Motors executed one of the most sweeping corporate reorganizations in American industrial history. 5 car divisions were collapsed into 2 massive supergroups. Buick, Oldsmobile, and Cadillac became one group. Engineering staffs were merged together overnight. Divisional identities that had been built and refined over decades were gutted. Suddenly, Buick didn't have its own engineers anymore. The Reatta program got handed to Cadillac Engineering, which was now somehow responsible for the engineering needs of 3 formerly independent automobile companies at the same time. Resources were stretched in every direction at once. The Reatta had to wait its turn. Then came the second problem, and this one had a name. Cadillac was developing its own 2-seat luxury roadster. Body panels designed by the legendary Italian design house Pininfarina in Turin, Italy. Then, and this is not an exaggeration, flown to Detroit on specially configured Boeing 747 aircraft for final assembly in Michigan. The Cadillac Allanti was going to cost $60,000, and it was going to be Cadillac's answer to the Mercedes SL. General Motors decided the Allanti would launch first. Cadillac was the prestige division. Cadillac got the priority. The Reatta had to wait behind its more expensive, more pampered corporate sibling. Then came the third problem. Where do you actually build a low-volume specialty car inside a manufacturing system that was designed entirely for high volume? GM had no plant that made economic sense for a vehicle they hoped to sell 20,000 units a year. A conventional assembly plant runs somewhere between 150,000 and 250,000 cars annually. Putting 20,000 cars through a facility like that would be like renting a football stadium to host a dinner party for 12 people. The per-unit economics collapse completely. You simply cannot run a plant designed for 60 cars an hour at a rate of 2 cars an hour and have the numbers make any sense. So the program manager assembled a remarkable international coalition just to get this car developed. Engineering work was handled in England. Manufacturing engineering was handled in England. The stamping die engineering was done in Japan. Prototypes were built by Aston Martin Tickford, yes, that Aston Martin, using body panels from another British supplier. Testing was conducted at a General Motors proving ground in the United Kingdom. For a car destined to be built in Lansing, Michigan, and sold to dentists and attorneys in suburban Ohio, an extraordinary percentage of its entire development happened on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean.
Now,
here is where the Reatta story becomes something genuinely unlike anything else in the history of American automobile manufacturing. General Motors took a 50-year-old former axle foundry in Lansing, Michigan, originally built in 1919 as the Oldsmobile differential plant, and invested $110 million to convert it into something they called the Reatta Craft Center. 641,000 square feet of repurposed industrial space. Their own sheet metal stamping operation. Their own body shop. Their own assembly area. PPG Industries set up a complete paint operation on-site under subcontract. But here is the detail that separates this factory from every other automobile assembly plant in the United States. There was no assembly line. Not a slow one. Not a partial one. No moving conveyor belt anywhere in the building. Instead, the Reatta was built at a series of fixed craft stations. Small teams of skilled workers would spend up to 30 minutes at each station, performing as many as 25 separate operations on a single vehicle. When they finished, the car was moved to the next station, not by a conveyor belt, but by automated guided vehicles. Computer-controlled carts rolling silently across the factory floor on magnetic strips embedded in the concrete. The pace was 15 cars per shift. At maximum capacity, running 2 8-hour shifts, the plant could produce 56 Reattas in a single day. A conventional GM assembly plant could produce more cars than that in a single hour. The plant manager, Bob Thompson, acknowledged it was at least 15% less efficient on a man-hours per vehicle basis. But the math worked completely differently at low volume. This factory could break even making fewer than 15,000 cars a year. The whole point was that you didn't need to sell 250,000 units to justify the factory's existence. General Motors had just killed the Pontiac Fiero, partly because it couldn't justify building only 25,000 cars a year at a plant designed for 100,000. The Craft Center was supposed to be the answer to that problem permanently. The workers were former Axle plant employees who had been retrained under a $5 million program. And they were not supervised by traditional quality inspectors walking a moving line. Each worker was responsible for their own output. They performed their assigned operations, inspected the vehicle themselves, and made a conscious personal decision to release it to the next station. Thompson loved explaining this distinction. On a conventional assembly line, if a worker discovers a problem, they face a genuinely difficult choice: stop the entire line, disrupt everything, bring production to a halt for everyone. The pressure not to do that is enormous. Workers sometimes let things pass that shouldn't pass. At the Craft Center, if the worker found something wrong, they simply didn't send the car forward. Nobody had to stop anything. Nobody had to be the person who shut down the whole operation. Just quiet, individual accountability built directly into the process. And when a Reatta completed its journey through the Craft Center, when it had passed through every station and been signed off at every stage, it left with something no other American production car had ever offered: a leather-bound portfolio. Inside, the owner's manual, a pen, a flashlight, and a tire gauge. And a craftsman's log containing the actual signatures of every supervisor responsible for that specific car's assembly. Real names, real people, the human beings who built your car on paper in your trunk. It was the kind of gesture you would expect from a small Italian coach builder in the 1950s. Not from a converted axle factory in Lansing, Michigan. But there it was. The first pilot car rolled out of the Craft Center in December of 1986. Series production began in January of 1988, 4.5 years behind the original schedule. So, what did $25,000 and 7 years of development actually buy you when you walked into a Buick dealership in January of 1988? The Reatta was a front-wheel drive, 2-seat coupe built on a shortened Buick Riviera platform. It weighed around 3,500 pounds. It had 4-wheel disc brakes with anti-lock. Fully independent suspension. Solid, proven mechanical underpinnings shared across multiple GM divisions, the kind of components that had been thoroughly sorted out over years of production. The engine was Buick's 3800 V6, a pushrod design with lineage tracing all the way back to 1961. For the Reatta, it received balance shafts, multi-port fuel injection, and various refinements that made it genuinely smooth and genuinely refined. 165 horsepower. 210 pound-feet of torque, paired exclusively with a 4-speed automatic transaxle. No manual transmission was ever offered at any point during the car's entire production life. 0 to 60 took about 9.8 seconds. The top speed was electronically limited to 125 miles per hour, though reaching it required patience and a very long stretch of empty road. The Mercedes 560 SL that Buick was positioning the Reatta against made 227 horsepower from a 5.6-liter V8. The Jaguar XJS had a 12-cylinder engine. The Cadillac Alante, the Reatta's own corporate sibling, had a V8 making 200 horsepower. The Reatta was the only car in its self-declared competitive class powered by a 6-cylinder engine. But the styling was genuinely, honestly beautiful. Pop-up headlights, the only Buick in history to ever feature them, where the entire headlight assembly rose and fell as a single unit. A long, low hood. Sleek, rounded bodywork with a panoramic windshield and a distinctive bubble-top greenhouse that provided almost no blind spots in any direction. The full-width rear tail light panel was inspired by the Porsche 911 of that era. It required 14 separate light bulbs. It nearly got eliminated during development because of the cost involved. Buick fought to keep it, and they were right to fight. People on the street stopped and looked at this car. Automotive journalists praised its proportions. It looked like it should be fast. But 165 horsepower in a 3,500-pound front-wheel drive automobile does not deliver the driving experience that shape promises. You sat down in something that looked like a European Grand Tourer and drove something that felt like a well-appointed, nicely refined Buick Reatta. Because mechanically, that is precisely what it was. Not embarrassing, not broken, but never exciting. Not once, not for a single moment, exciting. Then there was the dashboard. The 1988 and 1989 Reatta featured something called the Electronic Control Center. A CRT touchscreen display mounted in the center of the dash that controlled the radio, the climate system, a trip computer, a date reminder, an overspeed warning, and could even pull up the vehicle's onboard diagnostic readings. The Reatta was only the second production car in history to feature a touchscreen. In 1988, this was genuinely forward-thinking technology. Visionary even. The execution was not. The screen washed out in direct sunlight, which is a meaningful problem when your target customer lives in Arizona or Florida. The interface was confusing to younger buyers who might have embraced the concept and completely foreign to older buyers who wanted nothing to do with it. And the reliability was genuinely terrible. Screens went blank without warning. Phantom error codes lit up the display, sometimes telling owners that every single system in the car was simultaneously failing when absolutely nothing was actually wrong. Settings disappeared every time you shut the engine off and came back the next morning. The touchscreen units developed a reputation for failure that has followed the Reatta its entire life as a collector car. Today, there are specialists whose entire business exists to remanufacture these CRT units using rebuilt components. Reatta owners send them hundreds of dollars to keep the screens operational decades later. For 1990, Buick quietly replaced the touchscreen with conventional push-button controls. The trip computer disappeared entirely. Sun glare concerns related to the upcoming convertible model were cited as the official reason. Unofficially, the touchscreen was expensive, unreliable, and driving away the very buyers Buick needed to attract and keep. And here is where this story stops being sad and becomes genuinely tragic. While the Reatta was grinding through its 7-year journey from concept to production, General Motors changed its mind about what Buick was supposed to be. Lloyd Roos had spent years pushing Buick toward performance. The Grand National, the T-Type editions, the turbo engines, the identity of a brand that could surprise you. But Roos had been promoted out of Buick in January of 1984. His replacement as general manager was operating under a completely different directive from the chairman of General Motors. Return Buick to its traditional territory. Family cars. Conservative designs. Comfortable vehicles for mature buyers. No more turbo engines. No more performance image. Corporate engineering handles the technical direction now. Buick builds cars for people who want comfort. That was the new strategy. The Reatta had been conceived as the spearhead of a sporty, aspirational transformation of the Buick brand. By the time it actually reached showrooms, that transformation had been deliberately and completely reversed. The atmosphere the Reatta was designed to arrive into no longer existed. By 1988, the most powerful engine in any new Buick was a naturally aspirated V6, making 165 horsepower. All the T-Type performance models were gone by 1989. The Grand National had its farewell run in 1987. The Reatta showed up at a party that was already over, wearing a tuxedo, to a room full of people in cardigans, holding a cocktail nobody had ordered. Buick tried to market it anyway. They called it a competitor to the Mercedes 560 SL, to the Jaguar XJS. Somehow simultaneously to the Corvette, to the Nissan 300ZX, and to the Chrysler TC by Maserati. Jay Qualman, now Buick's advertising director and one of the car's original champions, carefully avoided calling it a sports car. He described it as a luxury two-seater that emphasized comfort and practicality. Technically accurate. Commercially devastating. Nobody puts a poster of a car that emphasizes practicality on their bedroom wall. The market responded with the brutal honesty that markets always deliver. In the shortened first model year of 1988, Buick sold 4,708 Reattas. In 1989, they sold 7,009, against an annual target of 20,000 units, against a factory that needed 15,000 just to cover its costs. Buick raised the base price to $26,700 just as the modest initial demand was already fading. The Mercedes 560 SL, meanwhile, the car Buick had directly positioned the Reatta against, outsold both the Reatta and the Cadillac Alani combined by a comfortable margin. Despite costing $60,000, despite being a design that was years older than either American car, because buyers who wanted a luxury two-seater didn't want the best value. They wanted the prestige. They wanted the badge. They would pay double, triple the price for the right three-pointed star on the hood. And Buick's badge, however honorable its history, simply did not carry that kind of weight in that kind of market. In 1989, Buick engineers built a handful of prototype turbocharged Reattas. Fitted with engines related to the legendary GNX powertrain, turbocharged, intercooled, 3.8-liter V6s, these prototypes were tested and evaluated seriously. Car and driver drove them. The journalists came away genuinely impressed. There were even rear-wheel drive conversion prototypes running around GM's test facilities. One of those rear-drive prototypes reportedly got wrecked during a press driving demonstration. The turbocharged Reatta was, by most accounts from everyone who drove it, exactly what the production car should have been from the beginning. The performance to match the promise of the styling. The engine to justify the shape. The car that could have walked into a showroom and said credibly and confidently that it belonged in the same conversation as a Porsche and a Jaguar, and meant it. But Buick was out of the turbo business. GM did not have a suitable front-drive transaxle capable of handling the additional power. And the corporate directive was absolutely clear. Buick does not build fast cars. The prototypes went nowhere. The best version of the Buick Reatta, the version that could have made believers out of skeptics, the version that could have given this car the soul it needed to survive, never reached a single paying customer. Not one person ever took delivery of a Reatta that performed the way the Reatta looked. For 1990, Buick played its last real card, the convertible. American Sunroof Corporation designed and developed the manual soft top, which stowed beneath a rigid tonneau cover. The convertible was arguably the most beautiful Reatta ever produced. Long, clean lines. Classic proportions. The kind of open-air two-seater that looked like it belonged on the Pacific Coast Highway on a warm California afternoon. But removing the fixed roof from the platform created significant structural flex. The solidity that made the coupe feel substantial simply wasn't there without a rigid roof holding everything together. And the convertible was priced at $34,995. A Chrysler LeBaron convertible offered a similar open-air cruising experience for under $20,000. 1990 was the best year the Reatta ever had. 8,515 total sales, including 2,132 convertibles. Better. Meaningfully better. But still less than half the annual target the program needed to justify its existence. For 1991, Buick made genuine improvements. The engine was bumped to 170 horsepower with revised fuel injection, an electronically controlled transmission, new wheels, updated anti-lock brakes, automatic headlamps, and finally, 3 model years into production, a cup holder in the center console. A $25,000 car had been delivered to customers for 3 years without a cup holder. The 1991 Reatta was the best one they ever built. It was also, clearly, the last. Even before the 1991 models reached dealerships, the general manager had recommended cancellation. The car was losing money with no realistic path to profitability in sight. And on March 5, 1991, Lloyd Roos made the announcement. Roos was, by that point, president of General Motors. The man who had conceived the Reatta, who had championed it through an entire decade of corporate resistance, reorganization, budget cuts, and strategy reversals. Who had fought for this car at every stage when easier paths were available. The man who believed in the Reatta more than anyone else in the entire corporation. He was the one who announced its death. 1,520 Reattas were built for the 1991 model year. 305 of them were convertibles. And here is a detail that says everything about what this car was and what the people who built it believed it should be, right up until the very final moment. Buick engineers individually tested every single 1991 convertible for structural rigidity. They sorted them by hand into 3 groups. The cars good enough for customers went to dealerships. 62 cars that shook too badly were destroyed entirely.
Crushed.
115 cars in the middle, not quite acceptable, but not quite bad enough to scrap, were sold to employees at a discount. Even at the very end, on the last days of production, they were hand-sorting their handmade cars into piles. Good enough. Not good enough. Somewhere in between. Production ended on May 10, 1991. The Craft Center did not close with the Reatta. It was renamed and assigned to build the GM EV1, the first modern mass-produced electric car in America, using the same craft station philosophy. It survived another 15 years, producing Eldorados and Cavalier convertibles and the Chevrolet SSR, before General Motors finally closed it in 2006. The last vehicle off the line was a one-of-a-kind black and silver SSR, assembled on March 17th of that year. The building that had been an axle foundry, then a hand-built car factory, then an electric vehicle plant, then a convertible assembly shop was done. Still. Quiet. Lloyd Roos lasted less than 2 years as president of General Motors before a boardroom revolt removed him in April of 1992. The corporation was losing money at a rate that shocked even those who knew the situation was bad. Over $30 billion in losses between 1990 and 1992 combined. It was a crisis that consumed chairmen, executives, and corporate direction alike. Roos retired from General Motors in 1993. He spent the years that followed in education and community service, helping create a center for advanced technologies at Focus Hope in Detroit, a program that put more than 300 underserved young people through accredited engineering degree programs. He died in April of 2023 at 86 years old. His son Mark was, by then, the president of General Motors. 4 generations of the Roos family have worked at that company. The Reatta was, in many ways, the most personal project of Lloyd's professional life. And he had to be the one to end it. Today, a clean Reatta coupe can be found for under $10,000. Convertibles command a modest premium, but rarely approach $20,000. The 3800 V6 was shared with half the GM lineup of that era, which means any competent mechanic anywhere in America can work on one without special tools or rare knowledge. Parts are cheap. Parts are widely available. Some owners have put 300,000 miles on their Reattas without encountering serious mechanical problems. The car works. It always worked. It was always well built, genuinely well assembled, and honestly reliable. It just never found its audience. Because by the time it was built, even Buick couldn't agree on who that audience was supposed to be. Buick now sells nothing but SUVs. The Reatta was the last time the brand reached for something beyond comfortable anonymity. The last time anyone at Buick tried to build something that would make a 30-year-old slow down, pull over, and stare. A car assembled by craftspeople. Signed by supervisors. Shipped with a leather portfolio, a pen, a flashlight, a tire gauge, and a logbook bearing the real names of the real people who built it. Killed by the man who loved it most. If you have ever owned a Reatta, or your dad had one sitting quietly in the garage, tell me about it in the comments. These cars deserve to be remembered. And if you made it all the way to the end of the story, you already know what to do.
Subscribe.
We tell stories like this every single week.